Hello everyone, I'm here for my first Why You Should Read video, where I do the hard sales job on a video on why I think it's great, and you should read it. I am going to do that for a series that I kind of want to say it's underappreciated, but book one is like 100,000 ratings on Goodreads, and it's by a best-selling author, but relative to his other series, I think it's underappreciated, and the people I talk to haven't read it, and I want them to. So that's really what it's for. It's on the booktube communities I'm in. I think it's underrated, and that is Codex Alera by Jim Butcher. Let's get into it. The course of history is determined not by battles, by sieges, or usurpation, but by individuals. The strongest army is, at its most basic level, a collection of individuals. Their decisions, their passions, their foolishness, and their dreams shape the years to come. If there is any lesson to be learned from history, it is that all too often, the fate of armies, of cities, of entire realms, rests upon the action of one person's decision, good or bad, right or wrong, big or small, can unwittingly change the world. But history can be quite the slattern. One never knows who that person is, or where he might be, or what decision he might make. It is almost enough to make me believe in destiny. Your kind, Halloran, are the most vicious and gentle, most savage and noble, most treacherous and loyal, most terrifying and fascinating creatures I have ever seen. Men plan. Fate laughs. As long as he was alive, there was a job to do, a realm to defend, and a captain to serve. Strength is the first virtue. That is not a pleasant fact. Its distastefulness does not alter the truth that without strength to protect them, all other virtues are ephemeral, ultimately meaningless. Knowledge is your weapon. Kill them with it. The first thing to talk about is what the hell is Codex Alera about? Everyone is like, yeah, I know it got started about the bet involving Rome and Pokemon, but like, what is it actually about? Interrupting myself because past me spent way too long talking about the part of this that most of you already know, but basically, for those who don't, based on a bet, the original premise of the world that we're in is that like 2,000 years before the story takes place, a Roman legion from our world ended up in a different dimension and ended up in like a different continent, and that continent has kind of elemental nature spirits, kind of based off a part of like Chinese mythology, which is the same thing that influenced the Pokemon. It's not literally Pokemon, but it's kind of like, Shannara and Wheel of Time. They're both based, like, influenced by Lord of the Rings, but they're also clearly different things. And then the Romans, gained some control over those elemental nature spirits and had 2,000 years to do what Romans do and build an empire. But we have 2,000 years out of the way. Let's talk about the now of the story of Codex Alera by Jim Butcher. And the current story that you have going on in Codex Alera, kind of the main driving thread, is about an empire that's been around for a long time, but is past its prime. Most empires start to grow complacent. They start to just become weaker than they once were relative to both outside factors, and usually as empires get bigger, risks of civil war increase. And Codex Alera is about a story where you have an established empire and a number of kind of factors that crises are kind of timed that they're likely to happen in a pretty small frame of time. And it's about people in this empire who have to deal with the consequences of these various crises. But let's talk more about who those specific people actually are. Let's talk about some characters, because in the first book, The Furies of Calderon, we follow 5 point-of-view characters. And in general, there are a couple more point-of-view characters added throughout the series, but this is definitely not a series that has POV bloat. It'll go from like 5 to 7 maybe. There's barely added characters. Where like maybe every other book will add an extra POV characters, but you're not going to get that many new point of view characters. But fortunately, Jim, if you've read the Dresden Files, he's very good at developing characters and fleshing out characters who just never have a point of view, because his other main series is incredibly successful, and it's all from the point of view of one person. But the main character, our protagonist, is Tavi of Calderon. And Tavi really got the short end of the stick when it comes to tropes, because we've all seen he's the farm boy. As I will say, this is kind of series that's kind of half classical, half modern fantasy, and he's the farm boy. But you know how most farm boys, they get the special powers and everyone else is stuck with not having special powers? Well, Tavi is the reverse of that, because literally everyone else has fury crafting and is magic, except this kid. And this kid he's like 15, and so it's past, he's not going to get any fury crafting, and he has no fury crafting at all. And I think, the way society almost treats him as like a freak, because fury crafting is such a huge part of Aleran culture, because everyone has had access to it for thousands of years, that having fury crafting, he's treated like a freak of nature, like he's a lesser person, because, he's kind of, Alera is not exactly the most tolerant place, so they're not going to treat people who they consider to have disabilities with tolerance, and they basically treat him like he has a disability, but they're not tolerant at all, so they basically treat him like he's a lesser person. And he's got just a brilliant character arc through this series. I don't think he's the most interesting character for book 1. Then in book 2, you kind of really get to see what he's going to become. And then book 3 is where he really comes into his own. And I love Tavi. I think he's a great protagonist. The next most important character down the list is a cursor, and is a Mara. And basically, the cursors are the operatives for the crown, for the First Lord. And she is on her first real mission in chapter 1. And I'm not going to say what that mission is. And Amara, also, I think, a really interesting character. She doesn't get as good as Tavi does, in my opinion, but she starts off better. She has to deal with, she's actually pretty, loyal to the crown. And she has to kind of deal with the consequences of that, and really a lot of other things. She has a lot of really good character development throughout the series. Also, something worth noting is, I'm going to talk about this more in the comparison to Dresden, but similar to Dresden Files, there will be a time skip in between each book. So you're following characters over the course of a significant section of their life. So, Tavi's 15 in book 1, but I think it's 10 or 11, the series covers 10 or 11 years. So you really get to see people as they, I guess if you like coming-of-age stories, I think Tavi is a very, very fantastic coming-of-age story. Amara is older than Tavi. She's 20-something in book 1, probably 24, 25. I forget her exact age. And then you get to maybe my favorite of the point of view characters in the series, and that is Fidelius, who unfortunately does not get as many point of views as the last two have gotten, but he's also a cursor, and he's kind of Amara's mentor, her patronus, I don't know, the Roman word. There's a lot of Roman words in this. Get ready for Rome. Oh, there's also a mix of Germanic stuff, because the legion that went up into Scotland was a pretty big mix of soldiers from Rome and soldiers from Germanic mercenaries. Anyway, he is much more morally gray than the other two. The other two, you're pretty clearly rooting for them throughout the series. Fidelius is much more morally gray, and he's one of my favorite morally gray characters I've read. I think Jaime Lannister is a better morally gray character, and is Glokta just kind of bad? But other than that, there's not any morally gray characters I've read that I'm sure that I like more than Fidelius. His chapters are always a treasure throughout the entire series, and his character development is so good. And also, Jim Butcher really gets to show off his voice with these various characters. Dresden Files is obviously from one voice, And he does both an internal monologue and dialogue. He really gets to show off his ability as a writer to write different voices, which is something you won't even know he was good at it if all you read from him is the Dresden Files. And then the last I said 5 main characters earlier. I meant 4. The last main point of view character, starting from Furies of Cauldron, is Isana, who is the aunt of Tavi of Cauldron. She's kind of one of the more important people in the Steedhold, which is basically a village. That's kind of the format, because it's a mix of like Latin and Germanic, so you kind of have Germanic villages, but also like what would be the equivalent of big Roman cities. I think she is still a really well-written character. She would be the least interesting of the 4 main ones that you start with, in my opinion. She does have definitely some really fantastic sections, but most of the sections that I'm not a huge fan of, I don't really think any of the characters are bad, but she would be my least favorite of the 4. That's kind of your main ones, but really the biggest strength of Codex Alera isn't the point of view characters, it's the side characters. Because Jim Butcher's maybe biggest strength as a writer is his dialogue, and really his personality and voice just like bleeding through, and all the side characters feel so distinctive, to the point where there are side characters who are like only alive for 1 book, that like their personalities just, I remember it so easily in my head, and I think if you gave me a line of dialogue from them, I would recognize it was them, just because of how much personality his side characters have, which is another thing he can't really show off that much in the Furies of Cauldron, because it's a much smaller scale story than the remaining 5. It's a lot more localized into a smaller part of Alera. It'd kind of be like Wheel of Time if all of Book 1 took place in 2 rivers, would be my comparison to what Furies of Cauldron is like, and then you don't leave 2 rivers until Book 2. But I'm going to talk more about that later. So those are kind of the main characters that you're following. But now that's kind of what it's about in general. So now the question is, what makes it good and why you should read it? So the question is, why is this series good, Jake? Like, why should I read it? What makes this good? And in all honesty, I think it's overall just a very well-rounded series. I reread it in 2020, and I hadn't read it for a while, and for some reason I thought because less people talked about it, I was kind of worried I was going to like it less than I had in the past, but really I just read it and I was like, damn, this is just, it doesn't really have any true weaknesses. It's just really solid all around. But the first thing I'm going to talk about, like most series that I really like, is the cast of characters we follow. And this series is a really great mix of people who you're rooting for or just like love to hate, and people who are morally gray and you're not sure what to think about. You really get the cast of both, and I think this comes a lot from, similar to Dresden. If you've read Dresden, there are some characters who are clearly good, some who are clearly bad, and most are somewhere in the middle. And I think this kind of comes from Jim's view of humanity, and that's that most humans are capable of great good and really bad things, but also some people are just kind of suck. And some people are just good people. And you really get the full mix of it in this series, and it's something I really appreciate about it. Also, as I mentioned, the side characters, like the entire supporting cast, where you'll have a group of people in the situation, and it's not just like you're interested in the main characters and the side characters are just there. All of them have so much like personality and are so distinctive. And I think one thing he's really good at is he kind of like, side characters will develop both off screen and on screen. Because, obviously people will change when we don't see them, but also it will always feel believable. I don't know, I feel like I'm explaining that badly, but just in general, I think Jim has a very good picture in his head of what this story looks like from every single character in the cast. And that for a lot of them, it looks like a very different story than if you get it from the point of views we got. And that's something he's always been very good at keeping in mind in all three of his series, although one of them only has one book. And the next thing, and I think this kind of leads to the good side characters, is Jim Butcher dialogue. Jim Butcher for dialogue has always been absolutely spectacular at voice, and not just capturing that various people talk differently, but that various people will talk differently from themselves depending on who they're talking to. So like, Tavi, if he's talking with Isana, who's his aunt, is going to talk very differently than if he's talking with Amara, one of the other main characters, because they're always going to have a different dynamic. Or Kite, or Daroga, or Bernard, or whatever. And I think it's almost one of the series where if you cut out the character names, you could not only tell who was talking, you could tell, like, who they were talking to. Also, Jim is just really fantastic at really having personality bleed through people from just their dialogue. And so he's really good for characterization at showing instead of telling, because he has the ability to show you who people are just through what they say and what they do. So it's not like he doesn't have stuff where he's like, where he's just telling you what people's character development were, which is obviously just a really good way to do it. So I think in general, Jim Butcher is very good at showing and not telling. The next one I would say, I think the first book has some pacing issues, but the next 5 are paced really well. And 5 out of 6 is a pretty good score. And Jim is weird. He's kind of the same in Dresden Files as that he doesn't have middle book syndrome. Like for most authors, if you took a 6-book series, you would expect book 1 to be really good and book 6 to be really good and these to be okay and these to struggle. Jim just doesn't do middle book syndrome. He puts his middle books as book 1, and then book 2 is honestly just really solid all around, and then 3 through 6 are all similarly brilliant. And the pacing of all of them, like, it just never feels like wheels are being spun. It always feels like things are progressing. There's a lot of different plots in these, obviously, with a multiple point of view epic fantasy that takes place over, 12 years. I don't know the actual number. I'm just guessing. But it very, 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 very rarely feels like a character is spinning their wheels and not making progress. And there's not really any plot lines that I can think of that dragged out way too long, it's all very, he doesn't have people doing side quests, really. And also, I think one thing that maybe, I think having the gaps between that kind of forces him to wrap up most plot lines, in one book. And this will also, if you've read Dresden, will be familiar to you. The books they will have their own plot arcs. And then there will also be a larger plot over the 6 books. Multiple larger plots over the 6 books. But, one really main one. So, the main enemy isn't going to be the same for all 6 books. It isn't like some other series where it's book 2 happens directly after book 1 and book 3 happens directly after book 2. And it's generally all the same enemy. The series I'm thinking, which I don't think one is good or bad, but that's what you can expect in Codex Alera. And I think Jim handles time skips better than the overwhelming majority of authors, which makes sense because he has a lot of practice at it, considering, he wrote this before late Dresden, but pretty much all of his books have a time skip, so you'd imagine he'd get good at it. And he's really good at making it feel like if he's got 2 years between events, he's really good at making it feel like 2 years worth of things happened, but also we did the stuff that we skipped is not as good as the stuff we're actually getting. Where it basically feels like the side quest that would normally be the plot that drags out, we just skip that stuff. We don't need to do it. We can skip that part. So I don't actually know if I can think of an author who handles time skips better than Jim Butcher does. Yeah, I can't think of any off the top of my head. Although I'll have to see when I get to later Realm of the Elderlings books, but where I'm sitting now, I can't think of an author that I think handles them better. And the next thing I want to talk about is the military campaigns and the action. I don't know if this series would quite be considered military fantasy, but it would be pretty close. I mean, you've got the Roman Empire. Obviously, you're going to use it. And I think writing fight scenes and writing military battles are two different skill sets. And there are a lot of authors that are good at one and not the other. There are only a couple authors that I think are really good at both. And Jim Butcher is one of those authors. The military battles and also like the tactics and showing the consequences of war, and like the chaos and the confusion, while also having really like tactically brilliant stuff, acknowledging stuff like that supply lines and food are very important, but also not like spending enough time on it that it's just boring. Like for military campaigns, I think some of the battles in this book, in this series, rival like giant battles in like the Wheel of Time, which have like 14 huge books to deal with. They're some of my favorite military battles I've ever read. I can't say how good the military stuff is. And also, he's really good at small scale fights as well. He's doesn't resort to blow by blow. He's really good at keeping it like where the action is important stuff happening, where it's like you get what the character is thinking, and then you get how dynamics are changing, and he's not just describing he lunged at his head, and then he lunged at his leg, and then he blocked that, which even some authors who write great battles can fall into that sometimes. But I think Jim is just really, really good at maintaining that. And I've got two more things that I think are really pros. And the next one is the world building. I don't think it's an S tier world building. Like I wouldn't put it up there with Malazan or Wheel of Time or Stormlight. But I think the world building is very, very well fleshed out. It's not like a super world building focus, but the world never feels like it has errors in logic. Like it's very well thought out and it's well explored. And I think the best part of it is the various cultures, because obviously we spend the most of the time kind of examining this pseudo-Roman culture, a culture that started as Roman and Germanic but has had thousands of years to evolve in a really well thought out way. But also the other cultures they deal with, like the Marat and the Canaan especially, I think are brilliantly written cultures. And just in general, I think, again, I would like for the culture writing, I wouldn't quite say it's as, I'd put it up there with Wheel of Time, but it'd be like at least A tier for sure. I really think it's just extremely well done. And now there was one other thing. And the last big pro for Codex Alera is that it is a completed series that has a really good ending. There's a lot of people who don't want to start series that aren't going to get an ending, or have an ending that they have heard really goes to crap. Like it's why I have trouble recommending Lightbringer, or some people won't start like King Killer Chronicles or A Song of Ice and Fire. Well, this is a complete series. All 6 books are done. You can get the entire story, you won't have to wait, and the ending is really good. The way it got there was very satisfying, it makes sense, it's like a really good combination ending of being emotionally satisfying, but also not feeling like the world is done forever, and that there will be other problems that come up, like it's not unrealistically wrapped up. So I really enjoyed the ending of it, and it's like the opposite of some books that get worse and have a bad ending, because basically all of the last books were really incredible, in my opinion. And those are kind of my main pros for Codex Alera, which was almost everything, because it's just, they're really good books. A lot of you have probably already read the Dresden Files, or just Dresden Files by Jim Butcher, and obviously it's the more popular series from the author. And I want to kind of compare, because I think when reading this series, there's some parts and elements where it's clearly the same author, and there's some parts that are kind of handled a little bit differently. And I think the main things that are similar is, I think, like, if you look at the time he was writing, the quality, he started, Furies of Cauldron came out right before Deadbeat, and then I think First Lord's Fury came out right after Small Favor. And that's kind of like, I don't think any of these books hit I don't like any of them as much as like Changes or Skin Game, but I like a lot of them as much or more than any of the books that I list, from Deadbeat to Small Favor. And also he has a lot of like the strengths from when he was writing those. Like, as I've mentioned, he's very good at characterizing people who don't have point of views. The other thing he does in this series is the slow build world building. And I'm going to have, if you haven't read Dresden, you can probably skip this part. I'll have a timestamp to get to after this section. But if you've read Dresden, you know that book 1 is a lot smaller and the world doesn't feel that well fleshed out because Jim Butcher really, I think, hates exposition dumps, and you slowly get to know the world as you go. And it's kind of the same here, where book 1, the world doesn't feel that big. You're mostly in a pretty small part of it. It's kind of there, but then it kind of slowly gets fleshed out. And I think that's just because Jim just refuses to info dump the world on you. And the last one, which I've already mentioned, is the time gaps between books and really following characters as they age. Some of them through similar ages. Some of them are, especially like Fidelius is an older character than Dresden is in Dresden Files. But there are also a few things that are different. The first one, which I don't think it's different in the way Jim approached it. I think it's different because of the world it's in. And that's the magic system. In Dresden, the way he likes to answer questions, like the primary way Jim will answer questions, is there will be people who don't know anything about the magic who will ask questions that the reader also had. Because most people in the Dresden verse don't know much about magic, and then Harry or Bob will answer them. But in this world, everyone is magic, so the characters won't have those questions. So it takes a little bit longer to kind of figure out how the magic works. That can be one thing for the magic. You're never really told exactly what the limits are. You just kind of have to figure out what a water crafter can do, what a fire crafter can do, what a metal crafter can do. And the hardest one of those to figure out is what metal crafting does. I think even by the end of book 1, you'll know what most of it can do. And then once you get, or like in book 3, if you're paying attention, you'll really know what, like, the abilities of all the various craftings will be. It's not a super hard magic system. It's probably a similarly hard magic system to Dresden. It's just, you have to pay attention more and figure things out based on what people do in context more than you do in Dresden, where he has more exposition tools. If people want, I can do a deep dive into the magic of Codex Alera, and you can go in knowing that. It's not like it's going to spoil anything. But I could totally do that. But it's one like in Furies of Calderon and Academ's Fury, you really do have to pay attention to figure out what's going on with the magic system. The next thing that's different, but this is definitely in a good way, is aspects of the writing. And I actually think after reading Codex Alera, you will appreciate the writing in Dresden more, because there are probably lots of things in Dresden that you assume is a Jim Butcher thing. When actually it's a Harry Dresden thing, and how well crafted Harry Dresden's voice is. And you see that when you have a third person book. Because the characters all have very different voices than Harry Dresden. The most obvious example is that the characters in Codex Alera, like, Dresden has the complaint of the male gaze. It's way, 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 way less prevalent in Codex Alera. So you actually see, like, there's a bunch of things. If you read Codex Alera and then the next time you read a Dresden book, there's so many aspects of even Jim's prose where you'd think Jim just writes like that, but really it's that Harry Dresden thinks like that, and you're just that far in his head. So I actually think the writing here, it's just as good, but it's different because he gets to show you some skills that he never really gets to show off in Dresden Files, and I actually think it will make you appreciate the writing in Dresden more. So I am now going to talk about the potential drawbacks of Codex Alera that would be kind of what I'd consider the flaws of the series. Because even though I love it, obviously no series is perfect, and every series does have its drawbacks. And yes, I'm deliberately talking about this last, where I know the smallest have the part of this that may pain me a little bit, where I acknowledge the potential drawbacks of the series. And the first one is that it definitely has some more classic fantasy tropes, with the main one being that the protagonist grows up on a farm. Like, we've seen that before. I think the tropes are done differently enough that it didn't bother me, and they're all done really well. And I know like some of the tropes are spoilery, so I won't say specifically, but it does have some tropes that people, and I myself, tend to dislike. They're just done so damn well that it didn't really bother me. The next kind of one is that some of the plot twists, it's likely you'll see coming. This doesn't quite have the, some Stormlight level plot twist where there's a twist in the plot and it's like, I never saw that coming from a million miles away. Some I'm sure will catch you off guard, but there will also be some where you that you did see coming. I've never really felt, I think a lot of the ones that people see coming were kind of supposed to see coming, where it's, you kind of know what's coming and watching it happen is there, but if you really want to be constantly shocked about some like major plot twist, this might not be for you. There are definitely a couple really good ones, but there's also some that I don't think are meant to be plot twists, but some things that you will see coming. And the last one is, just like Dresden, the first book is the weakest, and then the second book is my second least favorite. I think the jump from 1 to 2 is already pretty big. It's not like Dresden, where it's like, I think book 1 is the second worst, and then book 2 is the worst. I think book 2 is clearly better than book 1, and then I think book 3 is clearly better than book 2, and then it kind of stays at the level of book 3. But book 1, just in pretty much every way, is the weakest of the series. And I think also it's harder to get into than Dresden, because there's some things that you have to figure out. Like, it's not Malazan levels of hard to get into, or even like like if you've read A Song of Ice and Fire or Malazan or Wheel of Time or Stormlight, you'll be fine. But it's harder to get into than Dresden, and you have to kind of pay attention and maybe read it a little bit slower than you will the first couple books of Dresden. Especially since in Dresden, Jim Butcher's constantly reminding people of things, because some people, like, read book 7 first. But I think he knew when writing this that really this is an epic fantasy. People are going to read it in order, so he doesn't do that as much. So you have to pay attention a little bit more. That's just kind of a warning. And then I'll also say there's a plot line in book 1 that would be, I guess it'd be like a trigger where that makes some people pretty uncomfortable. That's just a fair warning. But those are really the downsides, I guess, of Codex Alera. But I really think the pros vastly outweigh the cons, which is why this is one of my top 5 favorite series. And it's really close to like Dresden. And I like this. It's hard for me to express how much I like this series. And I'm really looking forward to, I know some people I know are reading it, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they think. Before rereading it, I was like, what if they don't like it? But after rereading, I'm like, nah, this series is just damn good. They're going to really like it. So I'm looking forward to that. Let me know in the comments if you have any other questions about Codex Alera. Yeah, let me know. Bye, everyone.